All right, it appears that the time is here and it is 1 o'clock, and so we will get started on our webinar for this morning. I am looking at, hang on just a second. There we go. Sorry, I was having a little lag in our PowerPoint. So welcome again to our winter webinar series. Today's focus is going to be on painting a not so perfect picture, applying strength-based approaches in early intervention. And our presenters today are Dr. Larson and Dr. Alisha Wackerle-Hollman, who will be telling you a little bit more about themselves when they take over control here. So in the meantime, I want to go over just a few details on how to access the webinar environment. And let's see here. There we go. Hang on just a second. We're working out some details here.
Do you want me to just go to the next slide, Maria?
Yeah, I'm seeing now your speaker notes again.
Okay, hold on. How's that?
There we go. Thank you so much. For those of you who are working in EI and also have other licensure licensed roles, you will get EI credit. Everyone will get EI credit, but also those individuals will also get some state licensure credit. How you'll get this is that after the webinar is over, you will get an email from the EI training program. In that email will be a survey. There's always a survey. Complete that survey, and then after that survey is completed, you should get an email with your certificate of completion within 24 hours of completing that survey. Now, just a reminder that if you're on this webinar right now as a group, you will have needed to register each individual in order to make sure that you each get that individual unique survey for the credit. Thank you. Let's see. Oh, here we go. Okay, so a couple of Zoom basics. I've already asked you all to check your speakers so that you can hear me. And I'm guessing that if you haven't heard me, you don't know this instruction, but I don't see anybody texting or using the chat box to tell us they can't hear, so I think we're good. Also on this screen, if you notice, you can click on the participant list and see who all is in the room with us. And you can also use the chat box. Let's see. So here's a couple of ways. Webinars are awesome. You know, for those of you who are also watching the weather, you know, we didn't have to get out and drive in our car to go somewhere. We all got to just kind of sit here and participate in these webinars. But one of the downsides to webinars is that we miss a lot of that nonverbal communication. You can't see us, we can't see you, and so we have to come up with some other ways to make sure that we're all understanding, or all on the same page and engaged. So we will use a couple of different tools in order to do that. First is the chat box. So if you haven't already, you find the chat box, open it up, and you can type your messages in there. We see a lot of hellos. We see folks where they've been logging in from. And this is also the place where you can ask your questions. We do have some question breaks built into the webinar, but put your question, once you have a question, go ahead and type it in. Either our presenters will address it at that moment, or they'll wait until the question break comes up and we'll address it then. Also, our presenters may ask you to do some reflection or answer a question, a specific question that they may pose to you as a group, and you can use your chat box to do that as well. In the participant list, if you open up the Manage Participants, you will see who all is in the room. And you also have the option of raising and lowering your hand. There's some other emoticons there that you can show, like, hey, thumbs up, we love this topic. Any of those kind of things you can use, as well as communication. The final way that we'll use our webinar tools, and can you?
Yeah,
thank you. Okay. Is using a polling function. So every so often, we're going to throw in a poll and ask you to respond. It'll pop up on your screen like this, and you just click on the appropriate response, and then you will be able to post the results as they come up. So I am going to throw up a poll here right now. And you should all see a poll that has popped up in your screen. Okay, click on the appropriate response. We'll give folks a few seconds to do that. We love to be able to see who all is in the room. Normally in a face-to-face, we'd be, doing this by hand raise. So this is kind of our way of seeing who all is in the room. And if you do pick an other, please indicate it in the chat box what that other might be. So we have some teachers, board certified behavioral analysts. Okay. If you haven't voted already, please do so that we can kind of get a feel for who all is in the room. Speech language pathologist. A DT working on their credential. Hello. Okay. Just waiting on a few more responses if we could. All right, I'm going to go ahead and end the poll here and share the results. So, Anne, we have a good number of CFC staff that is on the webinar today. We also have a good mix of all sorts of other types of providers. Looks like some DTs, some teachers, some very varied attendance here. So welcome to all. We appreciate you participating in today's webinar. All right, let me shut that down. And then I think, can you go ahead and bear? Oh,
I think I have to do all the controls from my screen today.
I think so. Okay. So we can go ahead and advance.
There we go.
There we go. And I'm going to turn it over to Anne and Alisha, and I'm going to see. I'm going to turn it over to you guys, and you can introduce yourselves and explain, tell a little bit more about what our topic is today.
Fantastic. Thanks, Maria. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I'm out in Utah, in northern Utah. The top of Utah is what we call it, about 15 miles away from Idaho, at Utah State University. I'm an assistant professor here in a Department of Special Education and Rehabilitation Counseling. But my background is as a bilingual speech-language pathologist, and I had several years of experience, worked for about 10 years as an EI professional and also in early childhood special education in the Twin Cities in Minnesota, where I provided home-based services and also services throughout the community in daycares, Head Starts, preschools, public pre-Ks, things like that. So I'm really excited to talk with you and get a feel for how things are going in Illinois related to EI and working with the populations that we'll be talking about today. Since my time as a practitioner, I'm now doing research, and I also train pre-service practitioners and some in-service as well as is happening this morning. So I primarily conduct research with children and families who are at risk or have language delays, and most of those families that I work with are Spanish speaking and primarily living in low income environments. So I'll pass it over to Alisha.
Hi, can you hear me okay? Just want to make sure that, great. I'm Alisha Wackerle-Hollman, and I am an assistant research professor here in Minnesota. So I am also in the Midwest, but just a little bit more north and a little bit to the west. And that's how Anne and I are originally connected. She mentioned her roots in Minnesota. I work is also in early intervention. I'm an educational psychologist by training, and I'm here in the school psychology program at the University of Minnesota. My work focuses on educational equity around parenting and families and around assessment and early language and literacy skills for both bilingual and underserved populations. So a significant proportion of my work works with the local Hmong population, the Spanish-speaking population, and our local Promise neighborhood, which is sort of modeled off the Harlem Children's Zone. So I'm also excited to sort of understand sort of the layout of how Illinois is approaching these things. And I think Anne and I are both really invested in this equity work and look forward to connecting with you all about it.
Great, thanks, Alisha. So I'm going to start with a little bit of background and acknowledge that the work we have here is based off of a article that Alisha and I wrote to be as part of the Division for Early Childhood's monograph on, I'm going to get my screen out of the way, hold on one second, monograph on working with children and families. This is a part of a series of monographs. This is the 17th. I don't know if any of you are familiar with this. You can raise hands in the participant screen if you are. So this is, the whole presentation is based on this. We don't receive any money from this, but if you're interested in having, and we can't share the article with you, unfortunately, but you'll have all the content here in the presentation. And Maria posted some links to the DEC monographs through the DEC bookstore. So just a reminder that members receive a 20% discount on all those purchases if you're interested in checking them out. Lots of good resources, excuse me. So the layout for today's webinar is on the slide. I'm going to talk through a little bit of background on the topic that we're discussing today. We encourage you to participate, as Maria said, through using the chat. We'll also ask you to reflect on your own experiences, things that you've heard through your time in EI as a practitioner, administrator, and also give you some opportunities to interact every few slides or so. So feel free to ask lots of questions. Feel free to share your experience. That will make it really interesting for all of us. So after we go through a little bit of background, I'll talk about some strategies. We'll focus on two strategies: person-first language and strengths-based approaches. And then we'll wrap up with an opportunity for you to set some goals for yourselves. And excuse me, sorry, still trying to figure out where to put my things so I can see my notes. So you'll have a chance to do that too. Sometimes when I ask you to reflect, I'll see if you can take a minute to just think about it yourself before you put things into the chat, or maybe don't look at the chat before you come up with your own ideas, so that you have some chance to think about things on an individual basis. Okay, so first a little bit of background. In the past few years, more attention has been paid to the appropriate supports that we can provide as early intervention practitioners for children and families who have experienced maltreatment, trauma, poverty, toxic stress, things like that. So DEC has a position statement on maltreatment, which includes recommendations for individual providers. And the recommendation most relevant to today's webinar is related to the use of strength-based and family-centered approaches. If you're following in the chat, Maria is also posting that link directly to this DEC position statement if you haven't had a chance to see it yet. And then that link will, if you click on the executive summary, it'll give you a real brief background on that. It's actually Catherine Kaur out of U of I was one of the co-authors of that. For those of you who are familiar with her work, she's an excellent resource you have there locally. So first chance for audience participation. Maria's going to put up another poll on the next slide, and we want you to select some of the options to just get a sense of what your background is with the DEC recommended practices. So you'll select that first option if you're not familiar with the recommended practices. Second, if you've heard of them. 3, maybe you've glanced through them, you know where to find them. 4, you've used them in your practice intentionally. And 5, our highest achievers there have actually shared the practices with a practitioner, a colleague, or a family. So you can see the poll there and take a minute to select where you're at.
We do ask that everyone who can please participate in the polls. That gives our presenters an idea of kind of gauging where folks are at. Okay, and it's not UPS. Apparently, I had an autocorrect. It should all say RPS, you recommended practices. Sorry about that. I thought I fixed all those. Anyway, they've all. I'm sure many of you have heard of UPS, but we're actually referring to the recommended practices. So keep that in mind. All right. Okay, just waiting on a few more folks to respond to the poll. All right. And all you have to do is click on the poll itself and click on the response, and you should be able to have your response come up on the screen. All right, I'm going to post the results here. So here's the results that we have, Anne.
Okay, great.
Looks like the majority of folks are not familiar with the recommended practices.
Great. Well, this is a nice opportunity for us to introduce them to you. So the recommended practices, they come from the Division for Early Childhood. They've been around for a while, but they were most recently revised in 2014. And the practices list, there are 66 practices for practitioners to use when working with young children and their families. There's a link directly to the practices in the chat box. They not only apply to early intervention and early childhood special education, but they're also relevant for other early care and education settings for children with disabilities, as well as those who are typically developing. And for those who are less familiar with the practices, they're split into 7 different strands on things like assessment practices, leadership, transition, interaction, and the most relevant to today's discussion is family. So I've listed a few of the family practices there, which are suggested for practitioners to use in capacity building practices with families. So things like being responsive to families' life circumstances, recognizing their strengths and capacities, and supporting and strengthening the parent's competence and confidence. So we'll talk more about those strategies as we go through today's webinar. But check out the practices. They're good to know about and to follow. I'm sure many of you are doing them as well. We're seeing a problem with the RP link. Oh, it looks like there's an extra E on the link there somehow, Maria. So if you take out the, if you take out the last E on the web link, you should be able to connect to it.
There we go, I fixed it, so.
Thank you.
Okay.
So before we move into the specific recommendations and strategies that we'll discuss a little more in depth, we want to take a step back and think about where you're currently at in implementing strengths-based approaches and what you're seeing out in the field. So on this slide, I've listed some example phrases that I have admittedly used or overheard from providers and colleagues who are working in early intervention. Things, and we refer to these statements as deficit-based language. So we're seeing the family as having some sort of problem. So I might say WIC families, so women and infant child care. So families who receive assistance for food or other social services. That mom that never shows up for meetings. Families who are limited English proficient. I once had a colleague tell me about a 3-year-old little African-American boy who had a language delay, and she said, he's doomed. There's no hope for that child, given his background. We talk a lot about CAPTA referrals and the challenges that come up with serving families and children who've had a substantiated case of abuse or neglect. So I'll take a minute now and think you can type in the chat box any other examples that you have heard, maybe things that you've used or had experience with. Kind of deficit-based language is occurring in your setting.
If you haven't already, go ahead and use your chat box to respond.
Good, thanks. Yes, I hear a lot about this, like that family must not care, or it's so frustrating, they're not following through on my recommendations. Good. ELL, English language learner families, lower SES families. They have language barriers. Good, these are all deficits. Yep. Or expressed as deficits. Good. Families don't accept the importance of services. Excellent. Yeah. So some other thing, another point to make, it's not always the actual written words that portray this deficit-based language, but sometimes even just the tone or manner in which they are conveyed, you know, those families. So you know who I'm talking about, right? Like if you have people who are getting kind of a frustrated day maybe, and you're connecting with a colleague and you're just so tired of those families. Well, what do we mean by that? And how are we viewing our families? And that of course affects how they view us. So I'm going to give a specific example here on deficit-based language and how it appears in something that's called the word gap. So I'm sure many of you have heard of this and maybe even seen a graph or figure similar to the one on your screen. I'll walk through it just a little bit. Here you can see findings from a really well-known study that was completed in the 80s and 90s by doctors Hart and Risley. It was published in 1995. And the figure shows an estimated cumulative difference in the language experiences children have from 3 different groups of families. They're split into different economic groupings. So first the professional group up on the top, the working class group, and the welfare group. So again, you see some deficit-based language, some out-of-date kind of terminology here. But what the figure is showing that there's a difference in the estimated number of words children in these 3 different income brackets are hearing from caregivers in their environment. And by the 4-year age range at 48 months at the far right side of the x-axis, we're seeing about a 30 million word gap in between what professional families are doing with their children compared to this lower income group. Many of you may be particularly familiar with the 30 million word gap. There's the 30 million word center with Dr. Dana Susskind. It comes right out of the University of Chicago. So of course here the terminology is outdated. We no longer refer to families who are living in poverty as welfare families, but the point is the gap on the right side of the screen tells the story about people who are living in poverty are not doing enough to support their child's development. It implies that because of their socioeconomic status, their children cannot reach their peers from higher income backgrounds. So this idea of the word gap, or this deficit again, is pictured here. And it also brings in some important stereotypes that we're going to touch on in today's webinar, suggesting on the left, you can see a Hispanic mother. Presumably she speaks Spanish, she's reading a novela. They're less likely to talk to their children as compared to what you see on the right screen, their white English-speaking counterparts, and you have the mom here asking their child, do you know what this flower is? And using nice engagement, the child's looking at the mother. So I want to take a second and just pause for some reflection and comments, more than a second, a couple of minutes here. Imagine what you would think or what you do as a parent maybe now, or as a provider, looking at this image and considering deficit-based language. So imagine if you were a family that you work with and you saw this. This was posted, by the way, in NPR, from NPR. Taken down later, but Alisha grabbed a screenshot of it. So what do you think about it? Great. So if parents and caregivers, this is what the message is trying to say, right? If parents and caregivers are not exposed to a rich language environment, they're less likely to pass it down to their children. Okay, so maybe this like multi-generational poverty. Anybody on the chat from Latina background or Latina background who or people who work with the Hispanic community? The image reinforces bias, makes generalizations about families from different cultures, particularly people of color. Yes. So what might you think? You're a Spanish-speaking mom who identifies as having Hispanic or Latina heritage, and you saw this picture. Or your provider comes in with this idea that because this is your background, I'm going to picture you as being more interested in novelas than you are in your child's development, right? So if we think about that and how families may be perceiving our help, a little bit tricky in some ways. So I'll let you do a few more comments. Sorry, I see a few more coming in. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Good. Right, thank you. I would feel offended. I would want a new provider. Yeah, maybe I don't want to participate in EI anymore at all. Good. So I might think this is just how it is. It might prevent families from seeking out services, judgment.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, bias because of my background, my ethnicity. Give it a couple more seconds and then move on. If you're still typing, feel free to finish up and we'll grab your comment.
These are really great reflections.
Yeah, they're coming up on quite a few things they're going to be addressing in the strategies. Thank you. Okay, so yeah, despite all of this bias that plays into the deficit-based language, the relation between income, parent education, and child outcomes, so where where families with lower income or lower educational backgrounds, on average, that group has tends to have children who have lower outcomes in their development. It's been shown multiple times in research, unfortunately. But so it's somewhat inarguable that that relationship exists. But what's so cool and what's discussed less often is that the effects of poverty and I guess mostly poverty and the family background can be changed based on parents and other caregivers' behaviors. So that when we consider family strengths and the contributions that they make to their child's development, the effect of poverty and other variables that are difficult to change become insignificant. So when we look at families who are doing a lot of talking, regardless of which of those income brackets they're in, their children have positive developmental outcomes. So in other words, caregivers' actions can affect development despite environmental circumstances and contexts that they're situated in. That doesn't mean it's easy for families, and it doesn't mean that we shy away from some of the challenges that families are facing. But when families are supported in EI through a strengths-based model, they may be more likely to affect positive change in their child's development and potentially continue interest in receiving our services. Anything else, Alisha, were you watching the chat? Anything else you wanted to comment on before?
I think we're on par.
Okay, great. So how do we do this as practitioners? How do we help families see and use their strengths to affect their children's development? And how do we stop ourselves from limiting families based on our own assumptions and biases? So there are two main strategies, as I discussed earlier. We'll talk about the remainder of the presentation. The first is kind of situated under persons first strategies, which includes reframing and growth mindset. And the second is based on strength-based approach strategies, like seeing parents as change agents, thinking about our own personal bias, and honoring families' experiences and where they come from, and seeing how that fits into the early intervention system. Before we move on to the strategies, I'll open it up for questions or comments based just on the background related to this topic. If there's anything else anyone would like to add, please feel free to do so now.
You can give folks a few seconds. I put the prompt in there about typing any questions they have, and we'll see if anything pops up here in the next 5-10 seconds. And if not, then I think we can probably move forward. I'm not seeing anything popping in, so I think we can move forward. And folks, if you do have questions, go ahead and type them in, and we'll either address them in the moment or at the next question break. Thank you.
Great. So yeah, feel free to put them in. Even if you're typing now, we can come back and chat about anything. So don't erase it. Feel free to finish up and put it in there. I know it takes a little bit of time to get your questions out in type form. So for now, let's start with person first language. I'm assuming many of you know this from some of your training in special education. Here's a great question, thank you. So we'll wait on person first language. Rosine is asking, and I apologize if I'm not saying your name correctly. What are some ways EI providers can encourage families to increase the use of language without being offensive? Great question. We're going to talk through specific things you can say and do and give you a chance to reflect on how you might use that exactly in your practice. So I won't answer that one explicitly right now. We're going to talk through that as we go through the strategy.
But please do ask it, remind us again if you don't feel as though we answered it in the upcoming slides.
Thanks, Alisha. So person first language has its roots in special education as a philosophy that puts the description of a person before the description of the disability. For example, instead of saying Down's kids, we say children who have Down syndrome or children with Down syndrome. The philosophy reminds us to see the child first as a child rather than as disabled or having delays. And it can be extended to parents and other caregivers who participate in EI. So on the left side of the screen, we've listed a few common examples that are deficit-based right now and can be switched around to be person first. So I'm going to give you a moment to think about other ways to state these examples. So how else might you say non-English speakers or poor parents or minority families in a way that puts the person first? So take 1 minute, write down your own ideas, or type them in the chat, but don't hit enter just yet. And then I'll prompt you again when you can start putting them into the chat box for others. Okay, so go ahead and start putting in your responses. How else might you say non-English speakers using person first language? Okay, so Susan had a good example there. Families with limited English. So you put the person first, which is really excellent, but there's still that deficit-based language in there with limited English. How might we bring in the strengths? Families who are not fluent in English. Kind of the same example. Good. So here we have parents who speak. Good. And then naming the actual language. Bilingual families. So that's very strength-based, something that a lot of people want. Let's just focus on the first one for a second here, actually. Thanks. Families who are multilingual. A mother who speaks Spanish. Great. You're hitting on many of the examples that we came up with. One that you may see in the literature is families who speakers of a language other than English. This shows up as an acronym because, of course, everything in early intervention has to have an acronym, so that comes out as LOTE. Some people even say LOTE. So speakers of a language other than English. You'll have many Polish immigrants in Illinois, so you could list the actual language. Polish speakers, Spanish speakers. Primary home language is good. I'm seeing lots of really excellent examples. So take a second, if you haven't already thought about the second one there, poor parents. How might you switch that around to person first language? Another good example, families with economic challenges, parents with various challenges, families with needs. Can you be a little more specific? See if you can narrow in on the actual characteristic. Feel free to jump in with prompts too, Alisha. Families who need financial support. Good, I like this one. Families living below the poverty level. It's really specific, tells you exactly what you're talking about. Let me give you a couple of the examples that we have for this one. Families who experience poverty, families from low income backgrounds, families with lower income, right? Part of it takes the presumed challenge out of it. Certainly lots of families who are living in poverty have challenges associated with that, but maybe not all families who are living in poverty would see that as a challenge. I can think of some families that I grew up in rural Wisconsin who were farm workers and would be considered as living in poverty, but not see that as a challenge to their family or their situation.
I think also there has been a trend towards the word poverty itself becoming within a frame of a deficit base. So I noticed that some of you have avoided using that term in your statement. And I think it's okay if you're comfortable with it, but if you're not, using the term low income can be a nice replacement that helps sort of illustrate where they're at if you feel like poverty in and of itself suggests sort of the negative connotation.
Great suggestion, thank you. I was just reading last night on a new update on different terms that are not as appropriate now as they may have been maybe 10 years ago. Mm-hmm. All right, so this last one here, minority families. How could you use person first language? Families from underrepresented groups is a really great example. So here we're trying to get at the historical underrepresentation, misrepresentation, bias, stereotyping that occurs for families from backgrounds other than white living in the US. Any other suggestions here? Just a little bit of a harder one. Families who are in a minority group, families from diverse backgrounds. Good starts. Just as we did with the non-English speakers, if you can name the actual ethnic or racial background that family identifies with, exactly, Michelle. Families who are Hispanic, families who are European, families from multicultural backgrounds, same kind of thing. So if you can, anytime you can specify to the background of that individual family is great. So here are some examples. So families from a particular ethnic or racial group, Arabic families, families who are African American, good. Yes, families from non-white backgrounds. Excellent, thank you very much for your comments on those. So when we're thinking about reframing and turning deficit-based language into person-first strategies, we need to know what our assumptions are to be able to identify them, think critically about the behaviors that we view as problematic, and determine if they're problematic for the family and the child, as I explained with the example of poverty. Is that a problem for that family, or do I perceive that as a problem because it's different from my background? Then address the behaviors that we see without connecting them to that socioecological frame that we're putting it in. So for example, instead of the family is not proficient in English, that assumes that I think they have not had a formal education. I may assume they haven't had a formal education, that they don't want their child to learn English, or they can't support them in being prepared for an English dominant school system. But if I reframe my assumption and biases by saying something like, your child has 3 beautiful languages to learn from the people in your home. Keep using these languages in the way that is most comfortable and typical for you and your family. I've reframed that. So from that family's not proficient in English to, wow, what an amazing experience that child has to be able to hear and learn 3 languages from their caregivers. Let me go back to I'm going to go back to the comment now. So we found it is appropriate to ask rather than assume, because many times some things can appear as if it's one thing and it is not. And I think definitely your first step is building a relationship with the family, and in whatever way you can do that, and then asking those questions. So where's your heritage? What's your background? How do you see yourself in this fitting into the neighborhood? How would you describe your child's background? Things like that are certainly appropriate questions to ask families. Did you want to expand on it now, Alisha?
I just wanted to add that in that context, asking those questions is also going to build on some of the other DEC recommended practices, including establishing these relationships with families. And so I think you're sort of being able to do 2 things at once, right? By asking these questions, you're showing the families that you're really invested in learning about their culture and heritage, and you're learning how to best sort of address them and communicate with them.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So Alisha will continue here with some other person-first strategies based on some research on growth mindset.
Great. So growth mindset comes from Carol Dweck's work, and she published a popular book in 2006 called, or actually it was a little bit later than that, called Mindset. Some of you might have read it before. And growth mindset really is a reconceptualization of a person's capacity as either being fixed or growth. And as you can probably tell from the title of that work, the ideal approach in this mechanism is to think about a child or family's capacity through a growth mindset. So I'm going to walk through sort of what the differences are, and then I'll unpack a little bit about sort of how the different mindsets might relate to these stereotypes that are formed in our communication with families. So first, one approach to understanding a person's long-term capacity is through a fixed mindset. And a fixed mindset is the belief that intelligence is static and that you are sort of innately attributed the intelligence and capacity that you have. And that in a fixed mindset, because you have this internal sense that you only know as much as you know, you tend to avoid challenges. And if something gets hard, you sort of have self-talk that relates to, I can't do this, and you give up a little bit more easily than if you were in a growth mindset. In a fixed mindset, when you hear feedback that might promote growth or suggest a way to encourage a new development of a skill, we tend to ignore those things and continue to sort of refrain from advancing beyond the limitations of where we place ourselves through this fixed condition. And then in addition to this, we also view in a fixed mindset other individuals' attempts to inquiry about our knowledge base as actually a threat to our success. So if someone points out that we don't know something, that feels shameful to us in a fixed mindset, and then we don't want to move forward from that because we are experiencing that internal guilt and shame around that. So a fixed mindset has a decent amount of research behind it that tells us that when children and families are in this space, it's really difficult to get them to see sort of the advantages of moving out and towards new skills and new development. The good news is that there is a contrast to fixed mindset, and that you can change your mind if you have, if a fixed mindset has been part of your profile. In a growth mindset, in contrast to fixed mindset, the idea is that capacities are always continuously growing, and that as individuals, as families, as children, we can always see the potential for new growth, and that we send that message directly to the families and to the children about how they might be able to extend new skills and abilities. In addition, in a growth mindset, families and children embrace challenges as an opportunity to learn new things. And so we persist, or we experience resilience in ways that allow us to be successful, even in the contrast to what might be placed in front of us, such as these factors that we previously discussed, like low-income backgrounds. Third, the growth mindset basically allows us to learn from the constructive feedback that we hear from others. So when someone says, I know a better way, or let's try it this way, it provides this opportunity to have an easily accessible model to say, I can grow from that and I can learn from your constructive criticism. And then finally, growth mindset empowers the individuals who use it or who are interacting with it to be sort of have autonomy in their skill and their success, and so they can be inspired to learn new things. So as a result, we're really interested in supporting families through this growth mindset lens. This research does directly connect to the ideas that we've presented today around these stereotypes and how we address and support families, because when we have underlying stereotypes about families, sometimes we automatically reside in this fixed mindset. So when Anne started and was talking about things like those families, we're ascribing to them a fixed approach to that. We don't think that they have potential to actually engage in the skills and behaviors that we're hoping for. Or when we say things like, oh, we don't think that that parent is invested in their child's education, right? We're also, again, ascribing this fixed mindset to them. By flipping the script and instead creating a space to offer growth mindset, or create space to discuss growth mindset statements, then we can move families forward alongside of us as practitioners in ways that build up their capacity. So here is an example of a scenario where you might see things like both a person first and fixed and growth mindset arise in these scenarios. So I'll read this and then we'll have some discussion comments about this. So the first bullet there says, Heather, an early interventionist, recently found out that she will be working with a young child, Myra, and her family. Myra is a 2-year-old girl with language and motor delays. Her parents came to the United States from Mexico almost a decade ago, but are struggling to find well-paying jobs and are currently living with Myra's aunt. Heather is preparing for her first visit with Myra's parents and recalls other poor families she has worked with who have had children with delays. She assumes Myra is missing high-quality language interactions from her Spanish-speaking parents and has few opportunities to practice motor skills in their small and crowded apartment. Heather plans to explain the word gap to Myra's parents to help them understand the importance of talking with Myra, and will find some toys to bring with the family to work with Myra's motor development. So first, I just want to pause for a minute and give you a few seconds to reflect on what do you notice in this sort of everyday scenario? And based on the things that you noticed, once you've had a few minutes to reflect, if you could just type in the chat box some of the things that stand out to you. I see wholly preconceived notions. Heather is already putting the family in a category. Heather's assumptions that the child is missing high quality language interactions. Judgment. Heather sure is making a lot of assumptions about a kiddo she hasn't met. A presumption of need therapy approach. Going in with assumptions is terrible. So many assumptions before she even gets to see the kid or family or house. Great. These are all excellent points. Lots of deficit-based language, lots of lack of positive thinking. She's making predetermined notions of the family. She's making plans as well that may not even need to be incorporated. This is exactly right. So Heather, in this case, she might be working in earnest, right? She might be thinking, I know how to fix this family. But it turns out that this family doesn't need fixing, right? And that in this case, taking a step back and helping Heather to sort of take the lens from a strength-based approach could really be powerful. So as we are moving forward and thinking about this, there's a few more assumptions here. Heather is presumptions, taking toys that she thinks families will not have, lives in a small apartment. There are so many things that could be going on with their lives and home. She needs to look into their good skills. These are all great statements. And I think sort of the next question I was going to have are what are the assumptions? And you guys have really highlighted it in the discussion comments that have come up, right? So she needs to look into their good skills and that she's really assuming many, many things. So now I want to take a minute to flip the script here for a second and ask, how could the language be adjusted to think about the two strategies that we've talked about to be person first and strengths based? So far we've delved into thinking about growth mindset and this person first language. How could we change some of these statements? Feel free to type in the chat box anything that you might consider changing. I see some ideas rolling in here. So does Heather know where the family speaks any English, right? So we already know that Heather's made assumptions about Myra's family, but we don't know if she knows that. And so if the understanding is the family is bilingual, then calling that out as an asset will be important, right? More people in the house might mean more exposure to more language. That's a great strength-based approach, right? Look at all of these individuals who can help build Myra's language development. Or maybe Myra already has amazing language development. We just need to understand a little bit more and unpack what's going on with her language delays. Maybe it's not related to her vocabulary. She doesn't need to compare this family to another family or family she has worked with. Individualization for each family, right? Let's keep thinking of ideas of how you could change to these person first or strengths-based languages. So here, an example just to start sort of moving that direction is thinking of a statement maybe like, Myra has at least 3 loving adults to support her development, right? Are we sure there's even a delay, or is it because she's primarily too exposed to English to Spanish in her home, right? The context that we have so far is just that her referral is for language and motor delays. So I don't have the case file to understand if that was completely subscribed by English assessments or if they did dig into if she was looking at their Spanish language capacity at home. But that's a great question to always ask, right? And think about where's this coming from in terms of how the language and the profile of the child's ability was assessed. Myra has lots of family supports. That's another great strength-based statement. So in the spirit of time, I'm gonna list off a few more, and then we're gonna have a brief poll. So a few more ideas for strength-based language are Myra's family is bilingual, Myra's parents are persistent in their search for good jobs, Myra's parents have resources, including Myra's aunt in this case, and Myra's family faces economic hardship, right? But we don't necessarily know if that is a deficit, so we don't want to make that presumption based on our last slide. So now I think Maria's going to put up a brief poll in relation to this and the word gap information that we've discussed so far. In this poll, if you could just answer how you think you would approach the word gap data that we talked about by answering one of the 3 responses.
Seeing lots of responses coming in. If you haven't already, please take a moment and respond to the poll by just clicking on the response that best fits your situation. I have to admit, Alisha, this is a tough one.
Mm-hmm.
Give it a few more seconds as folks are reading through the options. All right, I'm going to go ahead and post the results. And it looks like most folks would go the middle route there.
Mm-hmm. So I just want to unpack the results here a little bit to help contextualize. So this was a question about that graph that Anne showed a little while ago that historically has had outdated language around it, and the traditional approach, when you find that printed or depicted, it shows those labels that we saw: the welfare family, the working class families, professional families. And so this question was intended to sort of unpack that a little bit. 13% of you said I would not discuss the research for fear of offending the family. And that's a very real concern as practitioners, right? When we feel unsure about how to approach a family, sometimes we can turn to just saying we're not going to go there, right? And I think it's really important as practitioners to really be in the field as leaders and think about what are safe ways and transparent ways that we can talk about these really important things. So really approaching the families with transparency and trying to stay away from those stereotypical labels is really going to be powerful. But what happens if we don't address the core issue, then we miss an opportunity for intervention, which is also really important, especially if the child already has been identified for services. The second option was I would discuss the research, but describe the differences behaviorally. So instead of saying professional families, I might say, this is what the trajectory looks like for families who talk to their children a lot. And that middle line for the families who are working class, this is what the trajectory looks like for families who talk to their children in the middle range. And then that very lowest line, which before was the welfare family, this is what it looks like for families who aren't able to engage with their children as much as the other two groups, right? Or speak to their children very little. And I think that provides a lot of empowerment to families to sort of think about which line they want to be on with their children, right? How do they choose to increase the language interactions and the conversational turns, the strategies that we use to really build language. And I think that can be really helpful and pulls the sort of cultural frame right out of that discussion and goes right to sort of the source of the data. And then the third option was I would discuss the research as it's most commonly described. And I think, as we've mentioned today, certainly that's how it's published. And being true to the publication is definitely always sort of an approach that we've learned in our experiences through however our degrees were acquired. I think here in this particular example, really trying to be careful about those outdated labels is very important. So if you're taking that approach, really contextualizing that this is very outdated, and I want to share with you the results and then talk a little bit about what it means in practice today, could be one way to do that. But I think that takes a really, really skillful practitioner to be able to wade through those stereotypical terms and unpack them in a way that isn't offensive. So I just noticed as we were talking a couple comments, C. Collins says, I think delivery is key. You can't do the family a disservice by not explaining things to the family that are relevant to the child's interaction, right? Just what I mentioned. Explaining things in a way that is respectful and informative is key. You want the intervention to have a long-lasting effect, and that includes the caregivers being informed. That's a great way to think about how we would approach this work. Great. So I think our next window is for questions. So if you have additional questions about that, feel free to add them here. But if you also have just broader questions, and before we move into the next segment, feel free to add them in the chat box.
I'm not seeing any comments popping up, but we can certainly address them as they do pop up. If you want to go ahead and continue.
Let's continue on. So the next set of strategies that we're going to talk about are strength-based approaches. And strength-based approaches come from a social psychology research, and they sort of empower parents as agents of change in their child's outcome and their family outcomes. And then in this approach, we define success in terms of behavior and skills. So really, what are the things that we want to see change? There's a lot of research that use strength-based approaches embedded in them. So if you've ever heard of motivational interviewing, right? This draws on strength-based approaches. Also behavioral consultation, models that we often use in interacting with families, also draws on strength-based approaches. What the core emphasis of strength-based approaches is really the separation of the behavior that we're seeking from character, cultural, or socioeconomic status variables. And in this way, we really empower parents as sort of the first and primary teachers of their children to be the agents in that change. Okay. In this, I think that Maria's going to share an activity from sort of understanding your own bias, I think, from Harvard. So feel free separately to test your hidden bias. So you'll see a link on that. In the context of strength-based approaches, it's really important as practitioners for us to understand our own biases and limiting our own assumptions. And one way to do that is to really sort of characterize our conversations around, again, the behaviors that we're interested in. It's instead of the individual variables. There is the teaching tolerance citation and link that Maria just put up. In this way, you can identify your own individual biases and acknowledge their existence. We're all a work in progress. We all make these mistakes. Certainly, I do this in my practice here at the university. I know that Anne does as well. And we have empowered the people around us to call us in, I think, to say, I heard you say that, and I think that we need to reframe that. So giving sort of your working colleagues group opportunities to learn from each other is really important, and calling in around bias and acknowledging their existence. When working with families, asking families about their priorities. So early on in the comments on the chat, someone said, is it okay to just ask the families? That's really actually a really important tool that we need to have as practitioners, to be able to directly communicate about how would they like to interact around sort of their culture or their race or ethnicity. And is it important that that is something that's part of the conversation when you're talking about the behaviors that are changed, or would they prefer something else? So how do they prioritize those things? In different cultures, certainly you'll see different types of approaches that might mediate or influence the way that you engage in how you change behavior in young children and their families. And then finally, a core sort of component of strength-based approaches is just this underlying relationship, that when we are open and honest about our biases, our mistakes, and that we're working with families who we're hoping to learn more about different approaches, different cultures, different conditions that they're experiencing, we sort of put the work in to build these solid relationships that are connections between families and the practitioners who serve them.
Can I take just a minute, Alisha, to just call out how important this is to recognize your biases? And like Alisha said, Alisha's been a great collaborator in this work because she's let me know about things that I didn't know about. So if you think back to the vignette that I shared with Heather, Heather was me 10 years ago, right? So it was pretty easy for me to write that up because I could imagine any referral that I would have received that may have had a similar kind of description. And the picture that I would have stereotypically had in my mind related to that family prior to meeting them. So it's okay. I don't want you to feel like I can't have those biases. I have to be accepting of everyone. We all have the biases because we all have different experiences and places that we've come from and what our normal is based on our life experiences. But to be able to recognize that and state that, acknowledge it, is the only way that we can address it. So don't feel like you can't be Heather, but that you can find some colleagues who are safe to be Heather around and help adjust yourself to be less Heather-like.
That's a great comment. Yeah. Okay, so in strength-based approach, once you've had that open conversation with families about how they want their culture, heritage, or identity to be represented in your communication and the way that you interact, one of the ways to use strength-based strategies is to honor their experience. So consider a family's cultural background as an asset to support the intervention, right? What are the features of the cultural background that could be used to build the context of the intervention? So earlier when we had Heather's case up, someone mentioned maybe more adults in the household means a richer language experience. That's a great frame, right? That could totally apply to a cultural experience. So that's a lens to put on for strength-based approaches. Also validate their socioeconomic experience. So if a family is telling you, we're really struggling with socioeconomic needs, or maybe on the opposite side, such as Anne's example, right, that they identify as being a low income, but that it's not hindering what they feel like as a rich and fulfilling way to interaction with their family and their life. Anne's example was from rural Midwest families, and I also can identify with that because I was one of those rural Midwest poor families growing up. I think that socioeconomic experience can be really powerful, both in considering it if it's a challenge for the families and they directly attribute some of their challenges to that, or if the family is clear about making the case that it's not impacting them, and recognizing that that also is a great illustration of resilience, right? In spite of economic challenges, wow, what a rich and fulfilling experience that you've had for your families as you're engaging in these intervention strategies. Also, empower families to be active participants in the intervention. So part of the DEC recommendations have always sort of included this idea that families and practitioners are teams, and that both should be contributing to the child's intervention content and delivery. And so in this way, really empowering parents to see themselves as meaningful contributor to the child's educational success as every other practitioner that's involved with that child is a great strengths-based approach to recognize their power in supporting children's success. And then finally, building relationships by gathering background experiences, information, and sharing experiences. And so again, this just emphasized what we've already mentioned about relationships, but it's just really relationships in a lot of ways are the work in sort of creating success with these young families, and so families of young children, I should say. So here at the bottom of this slide, there's an example of sort of the strength-based language that we could use in conversation with families that illustrates some of these concepts. So it says, in hearing your story, I identified with some of your experiences. And while I recognize I don't have the same experiences, I do know what it feels like to encounter significant stress. Let's use what you shared about your son's home experience to find new and easy ways for you to support his language development. So in this circumstance, right, a family has shared that they are experiencing significant stress. And even though I can empathize with that, I want to recognize that I'm not in the same boat. I'm not trying to say that I know that experience too, but I can certainly empathize and we can move forward from there. That's a great strength-based lens to validate those experiences. Okay, on the next slide here, we're going to talk a little bit about thinking of opportunities to incorporate strength-based approaches in your work. And this comes from Bozik's work in 2013 that really sort of illustrates 5 different approaches to strength-based language interactions. And they're described as recognition. So today we're going to walk through each of these: reinforcement, empowerment, increased confidence, and healthy relationships. And so today what we're going to do is we're going to give you the opportunity to think about ways you can incorporate these strength-based approaches within your everyday practice. We're going to introduce the approach, provide a sample outcome for when that approach is used, and then we'd like you to think of some example statements that would fit into sort of the second column there, the strength-based approaches that are defined. And as we go through each one, if you could type in some examples, that would be great. So for the first one here, in recognition is the first one. So this is recognizing the family's experience. The outcome we are providing is the family is acknowledged and the practitioner makes explicit value of the family's current skills. So how could you provide an example of what that might look like? Oh, and Maria mentioned, feel free to make sure that you zoom in on your screen so you can see the text. It is rather small, and we apologize for the tininess of the text in each box. Sure. Can I repeat the second part of your statement? We're just looking for folks to think of examples of how you could use this outcome, or sorry, use this approach in your practice as the outcome is indicated. So for example, in this first one, the tool or the strategy in the approach is the recognition. We're going to recognize families' experiences, and the outcome we want is that the family feels acknowledged and that the practitioner makes explicit the value of the family's current skills. So what's a phrase that you could use that would do those things, right, with the family? It might help, I think, if we give the first example, and I can walk through that one and then move on to the other ones.
Thinking the same thing.
Oh, it's got to go over, sorry. So that first example is, your daughter was so engaged and interested in the song you were singing. It was clear she loves to hear your voice. Let's think about how you can use singing to build a new social skill, like turn taking, right? So in this example, we're validating the family's experience by recognizing something that we observed, in this case, singing. So this is a strength-based approach. Here's some examples. I will often praise the family for being aware of their child's needs and strengths. That is a great example. In EI, we include the family as part of the team, and that will set forth the goals for the child, right? So when we're sitting down and setting those goals, having the family to help craft those goals in a way that recognizes the things that they're doing at home or the strengths that they see. It's amazing how your daughter knows how to use English with her father and Polish words with you. Yeah, that's a really great one. Some of these overlap with reinforcement, our next one, because I think as early intervention practitioners, we're very good at adding in reinforcing statements. I can understand that your family schedule is packed. Why don't we think of how we can work things into what you are already doing? Great. All right, in the spirit of time, let's switch to the next one, which is the approach's reinforcement. And the outcome we want to have from reinforcing families' experiences is that the families come away with both strengths, recognizing both their strengths and their challenges. So we want to reinforce that we understand both of those things and offer reinforcement to support success. And some of these examples that you have already provided, again, overlap with that. What are other ways that you use reinforcement?
We help to see the example again. So I'll share our example.
Sure.
You can list some others that you might be able to think of.
So this is a participant example. Living in multicultural house gives so much ideas of using different tests and textures of food, right? So that's, I think, way emphasizing cultural experiences. So the example that we've listed on the slide here is, you've shared many challenges related to living in poverty in this community. You are persevering in supporting your child's development, even in light of those challenges, right? So reinforcing while you're creating sort of this resilient environment and acknowledging and recognizing the experience that the families are having. Any other ideas for reinforcement?
These are hard. So, I mean, even me as thinking about these examples that we're trying to adjust, it takes some time. I think in working in EI, we're used to identifying the problem, right? That's how children and families qualify for our service. So, and we want to remediate the problem. So thinking about this frame is sometimes challenging based on our training and our experience. Let's see how we do with empowerment, Alisha, so we don't run out of.
Yeah, I was just thinking about in terms of time. So the next approach is empowerment. The outcome that we want families to have in relation to using this strategy is that families feel empowered to view their strengths as an opportunity to engage in new skills, and practitioners practitioner and family power differentials are reduced, so we don't feel like there's an expert and someone who's constantly hierarchically underneath the expert. So what kind of statements could you say to families or work with families to sort of empower them to have some autonomy and recognize their experiences relative to early intervention? Reinforce the good job they are doing. I love it when our team tells a family that we get so many great ideas from the families we work with. Yeah. That's a great way.
So thinking about what words might you use to say that to a family? You know, watching you interact with your child has given me a lot of great ideas about how we might consider doing that in another routine to support their motor development or whatever your goal is.
So the example for empowerment that we have provided here is, I appreciate how many opportunities you are providing for your child to practice movement during your family's routines. This will help your child gain strength and independence in their mobility. This is a great specific example of what empowerment language would look like. Or share, so and one suggestion for participants is share a specific idea that worked for another family. I think that can go to really illustrate ideas around building the capacity and using some of that growth mindset. I think empowerment, we really want to try to emphasize what we know the families have internally as in their network of their family unit. And so that means thinking about what can I see in this family already that I can build on and empower them to feel like they have the skills and abilities to build on.
Yeah.
You are such an expert on your child's learning. It helps to support her growth and development. I like how you allow your daughter to take time to respond. Great. What a great way to support your child in sitting using a blanket wrapped up. Right, you're getting there, right? So it takes a little while, as Anne mentioned, to think about them, but to move towards sort of that embedded reinforcement and empowerment and help families really see their agency as we move through early intervention. Okay, the next one is increase confidence. In this approach, we want to increase a parent's or family's confidence to be an agent in the intervention and be able to support their child through early intervention. So the outcome we're hoping is families demonstrate increased confidence and adapt a positive view of their potential. So what are some examples of how we can build families' confidence? How do you do that? What are some statements that you could use? Oh, great. I can see how much more comfortable you are doing insert activity and how responsive your child is to that. That's great.
I had a great example. I was working with a practitioner yesterday, and she does a video comparison every couple of months with her family. So she'll do a video of them, the parent working on some strategies with the child, and then show them that video and another video a couple months later back to back and say, what kinds of things did you notice? What kind of differences did you see? And so it's really nice to be able to explicitly share with parents the changes that they're making and also the things that their child is doing.
Right. So let's put up the example here. In increased confidence, we wrote, you are using a lot of words to narrate what is happening while you play with your son. This seems to be coming more easily for you, and I think it will really help your son develop his vocabulary over time, right? Building this family's confidence and extending language development with their young child here. Okay, the last one on this slide is healthy relationships. So we've talked about this a few times now. The takeaway or outcome that we're hoping for here is that practitioners foster healthy and supportive relationships between the practitioner and the family. And we've talked about some strategies for that, being open and relatable around sort of the mistakes that we make, but also asking families what their priorities are in their cultural frame. So what are some ways that you could build those healthy relationships with questions or statements to families?
And there's a question about whether we can share these examples. Maria, I'm not sure if you can email something out again after the webinar to the same list.
I'll post the link again to the PDF because these examples I think were on the PDF, correct? Or no, they weren't.
So
Yeah, Yes, I can do that if that's okay. Okay.
Definitely.
I see the comments, and we're happy to share these ideas. So I feel like I'm pressuring us on time here, so I'm going to give the last example on healthy relationships. Someone wrote, treating all the families with respect and listening when they share. That's great. And we wrote in, I look forward to hearing what worked well and what strategies are challenging or don't fit your approach at home. We can debrief and talk about modifying the intervention so they are most effective for you and your family. So that's that idea of really integrating that cultural lens or that family lens on their preferences and priorities as a result of the relationship, and really honoring their experiences to build that relationship. So with that said, we're going to advance to any last questions about this section.
Yeah, and I'm going to just comment, we're going to talk about goal building after this questions too. So a couple of really good suggestions: treating families with respect, allowing for open forums, having families ask you questions. Push yourselves to think of the words that you would use in your sessions with families in your home visits. What would you actually say to them to demonstrate respect, to encourage them to share information with you? What words do you use to check in with a family? See if you can, get into some scenarios, maybe do some role playing, things like that with a colleague. We'll see any questions about this last section, and we certainly can share that slide back with you completed.
Mm-hmm.
There are some additional examples more specific to language development in the article in that DEC monograph as well.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we're going to go through, think of some of the goals that you might have when you're thinking about implementing what we've discussed today into your everyday practice and as an EI professional. So as you're thinking about these, I've listed some example potential places to start. They're not maybe as specific as I would like them to be for myself personally, but just some broad ideas. So maybe if you can narrow it down to what's something that you can do tomorrow, even this afternoon if you have a home visit you're heading to, what's something that you can do within a week or a month. So think of a couple of ideas and feel free to share them in the chat so we can kind of learn from each other.
Sorry, I'm trying to post the link for the slide, and apparently I posted a different link. I have a link created, and I'll get that posted here momentarily.
Great, thanks. Okay, so besides getting your certificate and completing your survey, what will you do tomorrow? Maybe with a particular family, or the next time you get a referral. Great, good suggestion to stay behind towards the end of an evaluation, give some empowerment to families. It is a lot when you're going in for an evaluation, so that sounds like a great role. Thank you. Asking family-centered questions. How has the parenting been for you this week? Good, so kind of starting with a broad, open, how are you? How's your family? How are things going? And then getting into some more specifics. How did it go working on walking from the bedroom to the bathroom this week? Good, some kind of simple questions that are positive. What's something exciting that happened this week? What is, What's a strength that you noticed in your child this week? Or what did you do well this week? That's really hard for parents to answer sometimes. And it's a cool one to think about, that empowerment strategy. Just giving them a chance to stop and think, what did you do well?
I think to Anne's point earlier, it's really powerful to practice some of the actual statements that you're going to use. I think we can all think about these things in our head, but when we're interacting with someone, we sometimes resort to our entrenched language that we're used to. And if we're afraid we're going to stumble over our words, we tend to just not say it, right? So just actually practicing how you might rephrase some of the common statements that you use in a way that uses some of these strategies can be really a powerful tool.
Great, thanks for the comments. So we'll just wrap up with any last minute questions people have based on the content, or any kind of broad comments you'd like to share with the group. Thanks for the good idea there. Allow for more time at intake, capture families' concerns, answer their questions. Good. Yeah, interpreter trainings. Great. Well, thank you all so much for taking time out of your busy days to spend with us and to teach us what you're working on now, and ways we can continue improving as a field. It's another good suggestion here by Sarah. Create comfort to ask questions. Share if suggestions that were made worked or not. So definitely not assuming that what we suggested or what we decided on with the family during the last visit, that it went well. Let's dig into it and see how that matched with their context and their experience, and what adjustments might need to be made. So I'll share our contact information here. It's also available on the PDF version of the slides. So feel free to reach out with experiences that you've had, and anything you'd like to share, any questions that come up related to this topic. We'd love to hear from you. And then here are just a few of the main references that we included. And then again, in that DEC monograph article, there's a slew of other resources for people to look into. So I'll let Maria take it over from here. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much.
All right, thank you. Just as a reminder, first off, I want to thank Anne and Alisha for a wonderful presentation. It really gets people thinking a little bit about how we, how we speak to families and about families, and what our own internal biases are, and how those come out in unique ways. So thank you so much. As a reminder, again, you will get an email from the EI training program with a survey, and complete that survey. Once that's done, you'll get your certificate of completion here for your licensure and your credit. That email is probably going to be going out probably around noon. So also, I want to remind you of the webinar series that we offer in the winter. Our next webinar is on February 19th. I hope that you will take a look at that, log in to that one. That's also going to be a very awesome topic. Thanks again, folks, for participating. We make these webinars go so much smoother when you are able to participate, and we appreciate the comments and the questions that you present to us as well. So with that being said, I believe this webinar is done. So everyone have a great rest of your day. Stay safe in the weather that's coming, and we'll see you all in 2 weeks. Bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank
Just
you.
a reminder, if there's anything that we said that did not resonate with you or your experience, we would especially love to hear about that. We are always learning about different ways to present this material and would really like to hear if something was not quite right, didn't sit quite right with you. So please share that as well. Thanks a lot. We'll see you soon, hopefully.